Bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans...
Hello, everyone, and thank you to this amphitheater for one of the last sessions of the Rencontre économique. Last but not least, you're going to see it's a great session waiting for us with an interesting title, Restoring the Power of Long-Term Thinking when everything is pushing us in the modern world to act in an immediate and urgent manner. How can we give time to time, and how is this a challenge for our society, for investors, for company directors, as well as for politicians? So in a moment, I'll introduce my speakers, but I'm going to ask Benoît Cœuré, who is a member of the Cercle des économistes, to introduce this panel discussion. Thank you, Brigitte. Good evening, everyone. The first few rows are quite empty. They're reserved. So it means that we only have a motivated and high-quality audience, and we'll see this during the discussion that we have with you. I think that this session is particularly interesting because in the last 2 days we've talked about a lot of public policy challenges around competitiveness of Europe, the sovereignty of Europe, and questions of resilience and energy transition, technological transition, artificial intelligence. Many things were said about what we should be doing, but we have to recognize that very little was said on how we can do all of this, even if there were panel discussion with politicians who explained how they consider the implementation of these objectives. We had a conversation with Mario Draghi, who enlightened us on this topic. But there's a fundamental question that goes through this whole reflection on the implementation and the political feasibility of reforms that can reinforce the French and European economy. It's the question of time periods. And there's a paradox here, quite a surprising one. We have a multiplication of stakes that require long-term thinking, the most obvious being climate transition, which is a profound change with decarbonization and also for adaptation. This is a profound change in our economy and our societies, which requires us to work in the long term. We also have limits and constraints to finance these reforms. So the tension between the reforms for climate change and competitiveness of companies, which also requires a good dosage of timing of the implementation of the reforms. This morning, I was struck listening to the CEO of Total. We talked about decarbonization and the objectives that they have, and he said 2050 is a bit too fast. And you have to take him seriously. He said, for me, as an industrialist, 2050 is too soon. And if you ask me to do this for 2050, it's going to eat into my competitiveness. So there's tension there. And facing that, there are also forces that cause us to think in the very short term, political constraints that are not new, that are there. Governments have a 5-year plan sometimes, and sometimes less. And that's also a strong constraint. The financial markets that ask for immediate results, the mark-to-market in the valuation of portfolio, etc. So all of this pushes us to very short-term thinking. So the question that we're going to ask to the panel is, how do we manage these contradictory forces between the needs of the long term and the needs of the short term? The former Secretary General of the United Nations said to choose the correct path, you can't look where you're going to take the next step. You have to look at the horizon. And I found that a great quote for this to motivate this discussion, and I'll stop there. Thank you, Benoît, for this introduction. I'm going to present our panel members. Jean-Paul Juliat, hello. Director General of the Bred, which is the Banque Populaire. Philippe Mills, the head of SFIL, hello. A public bank for development of the territories and export. Andrew Bailey, hello, Governor of the Bank of England. Jakob van WEIZSÄCKER, State Minister of Finance for Saarland in Germany, and Ignacy, NIEMCZYCKI, Secretary of State in the Chancellery of the First Minister of Poland, the Prime Minister of Poland. So thank you all for being here for this roundtable discussion. We'll start with you, Jean-Paul Julia, if you agree. In order to prepare this panel discussion, you said the long term is a key for success. It's necessary for you, but also for your clients. Can you say why and what this involves? Hello, everyone. I also think that the long term is the key to success. Since the start of time, no matter what you want to do, a project needs time to grow, to develop. It could be building a castle, a cathedral, a church. All of it takes time. Nothing that is beautiful can be done if we don't have the right time to allocate to it. In order to build a success, we need to roll out a strategy. Mechanically, to roll out your strategy, you need time. And the interest of time is that it allows you to have phases. You can have intermediate objectives. You can have successes, breaks, failures also. And time allows you, once you've clarified your objective, to find the resources to succeed, and you reach your objective when you apply the right means or resources. Benoit, you said the notion of time is also a cultural question. When you said that the CEO of Total said 2050, when I was at the World Bank, I was doing 5-year strategic reports when the Chinese were calculating over 100 years. So how do you consider the long term? I am convinced that time allows success. And bankers, I'm lucky to manage a bank. As bankers, we participate in giving people time. When you manage a Banque Populaire like I do, my customers are my shareholders, so I don't depend on the market. I'm a cooperative bank, so I benefit from this long term. And because I benefit from the long term, I can get my clients to also benefit. All of my clients need time in order to succeed. And the power of the profession of banking, we don't often explain what a banker does, but the power of the banker is managing different time periods. If, Benoit, you want to set up an energy transition company, probably you're going to need time to make it profitable. And Philippe will have savings that he wants to recover in a few months. So as a banker, my challenge is to manage different time frames and to succeed in giving depth to those who want to achieve their plan, and sometimes with difficulties. When you're a cooperative bank, you don't have time constraints, really, because the obsession of a cooperative bank is to support your customers, and the difficulty as the manager is how to understand the long term. It's very difficult. I don't know if this is universal, but I think there's a recipe with 3 components. Firstly, it's a type of personal discipline. How can I free up time to think, to structure my reasoning? It's a discipline for the structure that you're in. You must benefit from the differences, the varieties, the nuances. We're lucky to work internationally. When you're in Fiji, you're obliged to integrate the question of climate change because the rising waters concern us directly. But when you're a banker, you have different stakeholders, different customers, so you have to enrich yourself from these differences in order to understand. And then there's a last element, and I think this is true for everyone. What are the fundamental challenges ahead of us? Obviously, climate change, artificial intelligence, political changes, economic changes. So how can we organize ourselves to succeed with our thinking and to understand, to intuitively understand the time for the future? Thank you, Jean-Paul Julia. Philippe Mills, with the SFIL, you intrinsically think in the long term, and you'll explain why, and why it's important for the local authorities. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's still very hot, and you could probably be in more comfortable places. So thank you for spending this time with us during this debate, which is an important one. So the SFIL, why intrinsically do we think of the long term? We think of the long term because we're a public bank. We're not listed on the stock market. We have the main stake shareholder, who is the Caisse de dépôt, and we finance investments of our customers who often have timeframes that are long or very long. The investments of local authorities, of municipalities, of public hospitals, or major export contracts. So we're obliged to think in these time periods. They can go up to 40-year loans, and on average, our loans go beyond 20 years. So we're obliged to think this way. Now, perhaps we think this way, but maybe it's not completely effective. Jean-Paul already said very interesting and exact things. I think that there are 4 things we need to check when we want to think in the long term. The first point is, do you understand your customer? Even if you're financing them for a single project, do you understand the totality of who this customer is? And the specialized nature of our bank, we have 3 fields of action that I've already explained. But we understand our markets very well. We understand the market of the local authorities. We have 11,000 different customers. So we understand public tendering. We understand long export contracts. The second subject is, what do we do faced with a gray rhinoceros, that huge animal that you see in a distance? You're sure that it's going to arrive, but it's still far away. So how do you respond? Do you wait for it to arrive? Do you try to anticipate its arrival? And our profession is to anticipate. The most obvious topic is the energy and environmental transition in all the dimensions of energy, be it wind power, nuclear power, the rehabilitation of schools, or a new central heating system for a hospital. So this is important. We need to anticipate. The third dimension means not being too sensitive to fluctuations that can be legitimate, fluctuations in public opinion. And I see 2 sectors in Europe that illustrate this very well. I might have a French bias, but 2 sectors that illustrate this. One is the nuclear industry. There was the Fukushima shock, and for 10 years we did nothing, or we undid things, and now we see that we mismanage this. And the second is defense. We collectively, for more than 30 years, considered that we could benefit from the dividends of peace and not arm ourselves for our defense. It's rather like someone who has a beautiful home, well-designed, and for 30 years considered that it wasn't necessary to have home insurance. There would never be water damage. There would never be a fire. They would never have to use this type of tool. But the advantage of a bank like SFIL is that from the beginning we were able to act in these 2 fields. The fourth dimension, and I think this resonates with what Benoit said and what has been said on other panels, we must have the ability to generate minimum profitability. We need socioeconomic profitability for the long-term investments. And this brings us back to what the future real long interest rates will be. And in Europe, can we guarantee a sufficiently low rate for these necessary investments for the long term to be properly achieved? And I'm not entirely convinced that that is the case today. Thank you, Philippe. Andrew Bailey, you have to manage the short time period also to pay for public procurement or tax credits or to pay the wages of civil servants. How do you think about the long term, and what are the big challenges that you have identified?
Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be back here in Aix. I think this is a quite unique event, and it's a real pleasure to talk again. And I think Benoit is absolutely right in his remarks to highlight what I call this tension of horizons. So I'm going to start by sort of setting out three things, and I'll come to your question, Brigitte, which is an important one. And the three things I'm going to start with is, and this is all focused on economic policy. First of all, we're living in a world of much bigger shocks. Much bigger shocks are hitting our economies than had been the case, certainly prior to the financial crisis, but actually even some of the years afterwards. And the obvious cases, COVID, Ukraine, now the whole tariff issue. These are huge shocks hitting our economies, and we have to deal with those. The second thing I would highlight is that we are and have been really, for most of us, I'm not distinguishing between countries now particularly, for most of us in the last 15 years, we've been in a world of lower growth and of lower potential growth in our economies. And that's critical because, for many reasons, but it's critical for a very important reason, which is the cause of that lower growth is often lower productivity growth, and that is the direct driver of living standards. So living standards really relate directly to that, that lower growth and that lower productivity growth. That's a big challenge for us, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the third thing, and I'm going to sound tremendously depressing, this is why you get a central banker along, I know, but we have three big headwinds going against us. Benoit has already mentioned one of them, which is responding to the challenge of climate change. And I thought Benoit described it very well in terms of this question of the horizons and how we do it and over what time. There are two others. The second one is that we are all now living in the industrialized world in countries that have populations that are on average aging. And that's going to go on. This does not turn around. I mean, it's a very slow-moving variable in that sense. And that has a lot of implications, obviously, for labor supply. It has implications for welfare costs. This is a big issue. The third one, sadly, I'm afraid, is that the post-Cold War defense dividend, if you like, is over. We're going into reverse, sadly, on that. Now, I often say, if we had one of those headwinds going against us at any one time, we would think we'd got an issue on our hands. We've actually got three of them. Now, so to your question, Brigitte, your very good question, what do we do? And I'll come on to first what we do and then what we say. We have to go back to this question of growth, because growth is the only way, really, that we can actually get ourselves out of the sort of constraints that we all find ourselves in, that our governments are all operating in. So, frankly, raising the potential growth rate in the economy, raising productivity in the economy, where is the next so-called general purpose technology innovation going to come from? Because over history, it's those things that have generally moved the dial on growth. It looks like it's AI. So, I think we have to have policies that are obviously sensible about AI, but actually embrace it and say, how can we get productivity change out of it? And then the final thing I'll say, this question about presenting. I think there's a huge emphasis with this very important question of long-term thinking, of taking the time to explain what these issues are. I do think we live in a more polarized world. I think we live in a more polarized world of communications where people use these issues to justify positions. I think we have to take the time to say, this is what aging populations mean for our economies. This is what climate change means. This is what I'm afraid the defense dividend eroding means. This is the context. Growth is important. This is why productivity growth is important. I just don't think we do enough of it in any of our countries to really explain these issues properly. Thank you.
Merci, Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Andrew Bailey. Jakob von WEIZSÄCKER, as a politician, how are you acting in the short term while thinking of the long term? What are the big challenges that you have to take up, and what are the political and financial responses that you can bring? Everyone learned the fable of the La Fontaine about the ant and the cigale. So there's a debate in the long term and the short term. Everyone is aware of the situation of their own daily lives. You do your homework and then you go and party, or do you party straight away? So that's not new. It's also not new if there are many of us dealing with the problem of the clandestine passenger. So we hope that maybe the others will do what we should be doing and we can just follow along, not participate and benefit. That is not new. Today, if we're talking in our session about restoring the power of long-term thinking, there are certain developments, as Andrew Bailey mentioned, and others also. So we can ask, what is the impact on the equilibrium between the long-term and the short-term for these developments? Firstly, there's the impact of new systemic rivalries with China, with the United States, with Trump, perhaps with Russia also, and Europe. And it can very well have consequences where the short-term dominates the long-term. For example, for defense, I agree, now we need to spend more in the short term for defense, and this will shift the balance towards the short term rather than the long term. At the same time, if we're in this competition of systems that we've known since the Cold War, it's a competition of systems where we want to convince our electorate that our model is better than all the other models. It's very important to succeed in the long term for this. They were here today. There's the report of Mr. Letta and Mr. Draghi. It's possible that the recommendations that are in these reports be taken more seriously, even if it takes an effort, and it will have good consequences in the long term. In the situation of competition between systems, we need to perhaps concentrate more on the long term, and we're ready to do this. We want to win the competition. So it's very ambiguous. And the recommendation from a political standpoint, which was the question that was asked, in this ambiguous situation, we need to concentrate on the aspects that can help us to invest a little bit more in the long term and to not go on for too long. There's the same aspect with technological changes. There's the social media where the short term dominates increasingly in political and private lives. There are also aspects of planning where technology can help us to become more reasonable. For example, in health, at an annual scale, planning helps us to better invest in the long term. And the question of the aging population has also been raised, and that's very interesting. In principle, if we live longer, the time that remains, the electorate gets older, and it helps a democracy in the long term. But because of the baby boomers and a certain number of other factors, it's possible that the average age of the electorate, or the median age rather, if you like, will increase faster than life expectancy. And in that case, the short term will continue to dominate. So it's a very complex and ambiguous question. And now I'm going to really conclude. There's the ambiguous nature of debt. We can use debt to avoid reforms, to push them back. But at a given point, you're going to have to run these reforms. We can also use debt so that a future comes more quickly, to make investments, for example, in public infrastructure. So it's ambiguous. And in Germany right now, we're currently using 500 billion euros on public infrastructure. This is a massive investment. So the challenge is to ensure that we can bring the future in an accelerated way rather than extending a system that no longer works. So we need to find alliances if you want to spend 500 billion, but the state's not working well, and there are lots of bureaucratic obstacles, there are lots of obstacles, particularly in Germany, in the federal system, to really succeed. At a moment, this sum will intensify, accelerate the pressure on the reforms. It doesn't slow down reform, it will accelerate it. So the political advice that I can give is, in this ambiguous situation that I've spoken about, with the electorate in political life, we really need to try to use long-term in the developments that we have now. Thank you.
So a German talking about debt, that's kind of a rare phenomenon. Let's continue with the political side of the question with you, Ignacy NIEMCZYCKI. So how do we reconcile the electoral timescale with the long term? Because politicians are reacting in function of the news of what's happening today.
Bonsoir à tous, and I'm not sure if I'm really the one that should be answering this question, given that we just lost elections in Poland. But I'll try. So first, I think if we want to regain this sense of long-term, what we need, and this will not be something spectacular, we need more education. Why? Because regaining this sense of long-term is really about fighting populism. If we want to fight populism, and we've been saying this all around Europe for quite some time, we need more education. But I think, unfortunately, we've failed so many times. We need more economic education, we need more civic education. The second part is, I think, we need to look at the role of the media, especially social media platforms. And I think we are all acutely aware of what has been happening for the last 15 years with social media and the decline of traditional independent media. And I truly believe this is something that we need to address. And the third pillar, and this would be my answer to your question, is that we need political commitment. And here I will make the example of the Polish presidency that has just finished a few days ago. And I think we've been quite successful with advancing European defense during Polish presidency. You might know that we negotiated a number of important European instruments that will make defense, European defense stronger. But we had absolute focus during our presidency. Our prime minister used his political capital to deliver on that. And I don't think we're making any empty promises. So we're that serious about what we're planning to do, but we're also open to discuss any fears that citizens could have. And I think we quite often lack this political commitment and dedication, and my hope is that we can regain that, and this will to some extent heal our politics.
Merci. Thank you very much. We've got 20 minutes or so left, so I'm going to ask you to reply more briefly so that we can have time for questions and answers with the audience. I've got a question for you, Philippe Mills. You've been working with the state, with politicians, so the political timescale is not the same as institutions. Our mandates do not correspond to the long term. I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain why. Geopolitics, populism, the arrival of Trump, are all of these elements that can modify the way in which we broach the long term. Yeah, I'd like to get back to what was said earlier on by Andrew and Jakob, talking about the context in which we must act here in France and in Europe, given that the world is and will remain uncertain, violent and fragmented. We know the reasons. We've mentioned them. There's the battle between the States and China. And I don't think we've mentioned a return of the pandemics. There is the illustration through war between Russia and the Ukraine of a geopolitical divide in the world, which is set to last. And there's also economic fragmentation in the Western world that Trump seems to be wishing for. So given all of this, Europe is not organized in a way to respond. It can react to a more stable context where people respect the rules. But Europe is not organized to put their heads together and devise projects. So our way of reacting is to identify how we can create more projects together by relying on the different convergences, the goals we share. As a French person, what is happening between France and Germany is more clear than it was in the past, and that's excellent news for me as a Frenchman. Secondly, I'd like us to think all together about why every time we say that politicians favour the short term. Is there some kind of motivation for politicians to favour the short term? And perhaps, given the multiplication of all of these independent authorities, have we not restricted their scope? And the way in which we citizens, the way we perceive and judge politicians and what they do, and their mandates, and reducing the length of the mandates. Have we made the right decisions when we've done all of these things? I'm not sure, and it's my personal opinion that I'm expressing here, that in France, when you've got the president who is the keystone of all institutions since 1902. He's in charge of the major subjects, and his mandate is shorter than that of the mayor of a town. Then I don't think we're in the best possible situation. So my message has been slightly negative, so I'm going to try and finish with a glimmer of hope. Although you may find it negative all the same. The first reason for hope is that we have enemies. We have enemies. And so we can group together and be mobilized. It's good to have enemies. There are two recruitment agencies. We've got Vladimir Putin, who reminds us that the world is not all sweet and cuddly, and it's a dangerous pace, and Europe has to have strategy and autonomy. We've got Donald Trump, who reminds us that Europe must have economic sovereignty. And everybody can see these things, even those who want to be free riders. So that could possibly foster political consensus. And another reason for hope, for 17 years now I've been working on the financial markets, and very frequently I see investors, and now I am starting to see investors. A few weeks ago I saw some Korean and Japanese investors. There were two categories. There were those, this was back in April, they were shocked after President Trump's Liberation Day. They said, what on earth have we done to the man? Why does he hate us so much? We Koreans, we Japanese, we have always been pro-American in every way. And then you've got other investors, major investors, who went beyond that shock and horror, and they asked me, give us some arguments to help us change, at least in a small extent, the way we allocate our assets. So we have fewer assets in certain areas in the States and more assets in Europe. And that sends me back to what I said earlier on. If that happens, and if we organize ourselves so that can happen, then perhaps we will have the long-term leisure to do what we need to do. Thank you very much, Philippe Mills. Jean-Paul Julien, at the head of Bred, the bank, what is your take on long-term and short-term, and what's the difference between the two? Well, this is a major question, of course. First of all, I am a business. I represent a business. We need to be profitable because we have to be able to fund our development investments as we work with our clients. But as I said earlier on, Bred is owned by its clients. So I don't really need to earn too much, and I don't need it to be a linear development. What I mean is that in 2023, when the central bank brutally, massively increased rates, I decided to absorb part of that shock. So I reduced the bank's net result to enable my clients to absorb a smaller part of that with less violence. So when you're at the head of a business, you have to make decisions and find the right balance. This is arbitration, which was relatively simple because in my board of directors, the basic question is, how do we take care of our clients? And when we were preparing this round table, the question I had in my mind, and I'm saying this because we've got good results at the Bred-Banque, but there are good results because this is the way we think, and so it's not going to change anytime soon. Jakob van WEIZSÄCKER, what do you rely on to have a long-term strategy? Do we need independent authorities, politicians? And can we regulate the world economy when all countries have different timescales? Excellent question. And I think one way of answering this question is to say that there are situations where for the long term it's good to have very inert institutions. So if there are lots of shocks in one way or another, then that inertia guarantees that you're not going to take a predetermined path, and that can be a good thing. But inertia can also be a very negative thing. If the world changes in a fundamental manner, if there's not that phenomenon that is called mean reversion, there are processes. There's always a reversion to the mean. But if there is no return to the mean, then inertia becomes a real problem for society. I'm absolutely convinced that there are many phenomena today where inertia is problematic. And if we create independent organizations that are supposed to create inertia, well, I think we're heading down the wrong track. And to finish, I'll mention a very important idea that comes from Jean Monnet, great European. He had said that Europe is strengthened in crises. And so for him, he thought you had to exploit each crisis for the long term, to create institutional progress in the long term, to construct a Europe that is functional. And so for him, it was absolutely obvious that you have to maximize inertia, but you are in a situation where you have to exploit the short term, use the short term to create institutions that will serve Europe in the long term. And I think that's where we are right now. And Philippe mentioned many sectors and areas. The defense area, for example, which is not necessarily, didn't used to be a European subject, but now it has to become a European subject. So once again, institutions are very ambiguous, and I hope I've answered at least some aspect of your question. Andrew Bailey, same question for you. Is it possible to regulate the world economy in countries where the country's timescales are very distant and different?
Good question on regulating the world economy. First of all, I don't think anybody tries to regulate the world economy as such, but let me take one aspect of that question, and it goes back to this question about tariffs and trade. So I'm afraid that what we're seeing at the moment is a breakdown of what I would call the multilateral governance system in the world economy. Let's be honest, the whole tariff action is really going right against that. And I'm very, very much of the view that we have to get back to saying, look, if there are problems in imbalances in the world economy, first of all, we have to understand what they are. This comes back to the point about understanding long-term thinking. That's gone out of the system. There is far too little, frankly, analysis and explanation done now to explain what the issue is here. Secondly, let's say there is an issue, let's make that assumption, then we have to get back to a multilateral system of understanding those issues, frankly being able to speak truth to national power, where those issues are cutting across the interests of domestic governments, and explaining why in the longer run, and this is why the longer run is so important, that is the right thing to do, because without that, I'm afraid we're not heading towards a good situation. We're heading towards, for instance, at the moment, world tariff levels that are at their highest for over 100 years, and that is not a good place to be. And that emphasizes why we need, I think all of us are saying, we need to get back to this, having a system where long-term thinking, long-term ideas can be put forward, where things can be explained, and there are institutions that can speak truth to power, but they have to be contained. I mean, I'm a central bank governor. I have an independent responsibility, but I always say I'm not independent of the people that I serve. And I have a duty to explain myself to the people that I serve. That's absolutely critical. We'll fall down if we don't fulfill that duty.
Ignacy, NIEMCZYCKI.
Ignacy, in France we have planning for the long term. Is there a Polish model for looking forward financially and politically in the long term?
And for a chance to share the Polish experience. So actually, yes, we do. We have a whole system set up, and it's a law. So whatever government comes, it has to do those midterm strategies. So we're doing this, but the issue is that whenever a new government comes, the strategy is being changed. So even though there is a mechanism for long-term planning, what happens often is that this long-term planning is changed quite so often, and this is, doesn't really make much sense. But here again, I would go to my first point about fighting populism. I mean, if we want to agree on really just a number of key things that we want to deliver, that we want to change in the next decade, I think we can. And again, the defense is a very good example of that. Yes, we were late, as many of you have said, but Europe now has taken a major step. So whoever, 80% of the political spectrum right now will agree that yes, we need to spend more on defense. So it is doable to agree on parts of this long-term strategy. In Poland, we are very polarized, but if you look through the polarization, you'll still see that on some elements we do agree, even between the political parties that hate each other. So it is doable.
Merci.
Thank you very much, all five of you. We've got 6 minutes remaining. Are there any questions in the room? Oh, I can see some hands being raised there. So wait for the microphone, please. Hello. First question is the definition of the long term. Because what is it, 10 years, 25, 60 years? And then I'd like to have your opinion on how China is developing since Jinping came in 2013. with the goals he has set, including nuclear energy independency, AI and chips. They're more or less independent there. I think China has a long-term strategy with an authoritarian regime. But if you compare, you've got the Swiss model, which is one of the best for the people. The people vote directly on all kinds of subjects, but their long-term policy is favourable also. So my final question is, in your opinion, which is the best model for the long term? And are there not limits to democracy in the long term? Now, is anyone inspired by that question or that barrage of questions? Okay, no one wants to answer that one. Let's wait for another question. Don't want to answer? Shall we take several questions all at once? This is a very relevant question. The question is, in a competition between systems, an autocracy or a democracy, which one would be best to win in the long term? It's quite clear that democracy has a great advantage, whereby if things don't work, then the population will replace those who are in power by another team. And in some ways, it can be disruptive. However, in authoritarian systems, it's not the same. So there's an advantage. For example, you get the feeling that you have to follow one track. It's not very popular, but then for 30 years, 50 years, this vision, which also exists in Plato's writings, the philosophical kings who are very authoritarian, well, they can perhaps have a role to play. I believe that that's the competition between systems. Our democratic societies, which are open and social, we need to be able to demonstrate how flexible we are and how we need the long term to roll out our projects. It's much more interesting to live in a democracy rather than in an autocracy. That's a bit of a challenge. Andrew Bailey, would you like to chime in here?
We should take your China question head on. It's not a straightforward question, it seems to me, and you can answer it in a number of ways. First of all, I think there is a perfectly obviously good argument to say that China is on a long-term catching up development process. You know, sorry, is that better? I don't know what happened to that one. Let's take the China question head on. You can argue that China is on a long-term catching up, that what you might broadly call the Atlantic economies got ahead in the 19th century, and you're seeing a catching up process. There's nothing sort of surprising about that. I think the second thing you can say is, and the Chinese will agree with you if you say this up to a point, China's got a model which has effectively restricted domestic consumption for the benefit of export-led growth of our investments. There's a strong element, and it doesn't have a very large social safety net. And if you put that to the Chinese and say, that's the issue, they will say, yeah, we get it, and we know we need to correct it, but then you say, well, yes, but it hasn't actually happened, has it? And when we start talking about what are unsustainable imbalances in the world economy, and obviously there's a lot of focus on China in that respect, I think that's the heart of it, which is saying, to what extent is that development model, you know, it's obviously got the country a long way, but it's not sustainable in the long term, and that's the big question.
Philippe Mills.
Pour compléter ce que vient de dire.
Yes, to round up on what Jakob has just said, the first victim for authoritarian regimes is truth. Such a regime does not agree to analyze the situation as it is. You have to just grovel to the group or to the leader or the oligarchy. There was a writer, a modern writer, a Franco-Algerian writer who wrote a book recently and expressed such ideas. It talks about the truth, which is the basic building brick of progress. Our Polish friend said, if you don't have education, you don't have progress. And we can also say that you've got many systems, they're all a bit imperfect, but they generate a lot of innovation. And after that, can redistribute the fruits of that innovation. So I think in the long term, there is no doubt about it in terms of China. Let's meet together in 2049. You'll have a country which is already in demographic decline. The population is shrinking and has been doing for several years. So we'll see where they are. We'll see what their performance levels are going to be like in a few years' time. Thank you, Philippe Mills. 30 seconds left just to wrap up. So I'm going to hand the floor to Benoît. So this is really the short term. First of all, I would like to say how proud I am of all of the speakers who've been talking about a subject which should have been in the philosophy exams that the French high school children have just been taking, and tying it in with what they do in the public and private spheres. Secondly, I would like to say that there's a great convergence within the panel to say that, yes, naturally we have to act in the short term because there are crises, there are all kinds of events, but you cannot act well in the short term if you don't have a long-term vision. And that takes me to my quote, which I gave at the beginning. You cannot put one foot in front of the other unless you look at the horizon. And that has been demonstrated by our panel. Third point. We've talked a lot about politicians and policies, including the most recent question. As Philippe Mills has said, I believe that there is no innovation in society if it's not democratic. And those societies that are playing with the rule of law, whether they're in Europe or outside of Europe, they are taking a huge risk in terms of their economy because they are running the risk of dampening social innovation and technological innovation and economic innovation as well. Renouncing on democracy is putting your own economy at risk. And even in China, they're addressing that choice right now. Third point. There's a final subject which has rippled through all of the discussions, and that is the role of the state. The state is also there to give a long-term vision and to enable private players to have a long-term view, even during crises. We saw that during COVID. It was the state, aided by Europe, that enabled private players to continue to look towards the longer term. So that is so important. And for this, the state, and this has been said by Jakob, and I agree with Jakob, it will only work if the state has robust finance. If the state does not have robust finance, it cannot help private players to have a long-term vision. And everything that we said this evening will just not work. Thank you very much, Benoît Coeur. Thank you very much to all of the panelists for participating in this roundtable about the long term. And thank you to the audience for listening.